All right, Albert Breer, Sports Illustrated, one of my favorite people in sports journalism, one of the best writers, guy who generates more news than just about anybody in his columns on a weekly basis. What's going on, brother?
Hey, what's happening, Kevin?
I hate weather talk, but it is so cold in New York. It must be even worse in Boston.
Yeah.
This is not even me trying to make conversation about the weather. It's just me declaring that I hate the Northeast.
So we're putting an addition on our house,
No
and
big deal.
what like I this is all new to me, right? All of it's new to me, and so part of it is digging the foundation,
Yeah.
and so they dug the foundation last week, and it's like really interesting how deep it goes, like all this different stuff that you see that you would never know. And so what it means is there's these gigantic piles of dirt all over our yard, right? Like just gigantic, massive piles of dirt from where they dug. And that dirt is literally like frozen
Oh
now.
Jesus! You got
So
frozen mounds
that's
of
my
dirt.
that's my like that's the best like illustration I can give you of like how cold it is here right now.
Well,
And it's not even December yet.
frozen
I think we're
mounds.
gonna pay for last year. Like that's the way
Yeah.
it works. Like last year was very mild. Last year was not bad. Like that's the way it works. Like we're gonna pay for last year this year.
And if people think I'm going to go for an easy joke and segue from frozen mounds of dirt to Patriots talk, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to wait for the Patriots talk a little bit later. I want to start. You wrote a column the
Yeah.
other day about Frank Reich and his firing, and I did my monologue on Frank Reich and how I think sometimes it's best, even though you don't want to end up as an owner on the embarrassing list of, didn't even make it to Urban Meyer's 13 games. He had less wins than Urban Meyer in his
That was
tenure.
bananas, wasn't
That
it?
was bananas. But you don't want to end up on that list. But sometimes you just know something's not going to work, and it just didn't seem like everything was aligned there. Here's the question: I think there's some perception out there that nobody wants to work for David Tepper. I
Mhm.
disagree. As long as the contract, like remember a couple of years ago, there was a report that David Culley didn't get paid out that much. Like if the downside is if you fail, you get $35 million. People out there would take that kind of deal. This job is what in relation to the other jobs in this market? It's a different job, I know.
I would say there are two things you want to look at here. First, like the idea that nobody's going to take any NFL
Right.
job is ridiculous. Like that doesn't exist. There are 32 of them. Someone's going to take it, and they'll be able to find somebody decent. I think it hurts David Tepper in two ways, like this churning through coaches. The first way is if there's a guy there's competition for, and that would be like Ben Johnson, who I talked to somebody pretty high up with one of these organizations the other day who said to me he thinks there's two coaches that are assured of getting jobs on the market in 2024, and it's Ben Johnson and Bill Belichick. And so,
Oh,
which is kind of crazy, right? Like, but like I think that's where it hurts you is like if there's competition for a coach and a coach has options. And remember, how many of those are there every year? Like two or three
yeah.
tops, right? That have like legitimate, like multiple offers that can go multiple places. So maybe you lose out on that guy, the guy who has options. And that could be Ben Johnson this year, which would suck for Carolina because they really liked him last year. Then the second piece of it is the contract. And it's not just about luring a guy, it's also about sending a message to your players, to everybody in your organization that you're empowering the guy who you're hiring. And it makes me think back to what the Niners did in 2017,
Hmm.
right? Like when the Niners had churned through, now they had obviously the bad relationship with Jim Harbaugh, and that breaks off. And then they promote Jim Tomsula, and that lasts a year. They hire Chip Kelly, that lasts a year. They fired Trent Baalke. They look like a complete dumpster fire. And this was like what 4 years after they'd been in the Super Bowl. And Jed York gave 6-year deals, which at
Yep.
the time was like, I mean, borderline unprecedented for a new coach and new GM to Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch. And it wasn't just to lure those guys. It's not like John Lynch had like 5 GM offers. That came out of nowhere. And Kyle was like a good coaching prospect, but there wasn't a feeding frenzy to hire him. As much as anything, it was a message to everyone in the organization that we're going to give these guys time. And you better listen to these guys because this isn't going to be one of these situations where we just have, you can just wait the guy out and he's
Yeah.
going to be gone in 6 months. And so I think that those are the two things that where this could affect, how David Tepper has to handle the next couple of months in pursuing and hiring a new coach, maybe a new general manager. We'll see. Is one, it could hurt him with a guy who has options, and two, it is going to probably affect the way they have to write the contract for the new guys.
Yeah, and I completely agree that everybody's like, "Oh, no one's going to want the job." Someone's going to want an NFL job because, first of all, and I've heard people make this one before. In order to
Mhm.
even get to this level, you have to have a very healthy ego about how you coach football. Because you know what
Yeah.
you would do if you didn't have a football ego? You'd be in your Texas hometown coaching tight ends for your high school. That's what
Well,
you'd be doing.
it's not even that. It's not even just that though, Kevin. Like I remember having a conversation with a couple of guys who, I'm in a couple of these text groups, and
Yeah,
I'm in a text group with a couple of guys who are, relatively high up scouts, and they were talking about how, he's like, for a lot of us, our goal is just to get the GM job.
yeah,
He's like, then you see what happens. Maybe it works, and maybe it doesn't. But like, that's
right,
$20 million. You know
right,
what I mean? Like, and like, there's a practical piece to this too, where I mean, what's an entry level coach getting now? Like a 30 or $40 million?
yeah,
Like that sets your family up for a long time to come. And so just getting to that mountaintop, like, yes, there's like the professional, and every one of these guys is super competitive and believes in themselves as a coach, but they also know like a zillion things can go wrong. You could have injuries in the wrong year and wind up getting fired. You could pick the wrong quarterback and wind up getting fired. So much of this stuff, can be based on chance. And so just the ability to get one. And then there's the other thing, which is like waiting, right? Like think about like how quickly guys' names lose steam,
yeah,
you know? And that can happen very fast. If you don't strike while the iron's hot, like there's real risk to that. Like I think Raheem Morris is a great example of it.
yeah,
I would have told you 2 years ago when the Rams won the Super Bowl, yeah, he's going to get a job. Are we sure he's going to get another shot? And this is a guy who I think would be excellent in a second shot,
yeah,
but he's a defensive coach, right? The Rams aren't winning anymore.
right.
Is someone going to hire him? In an environment when 60 or 70% of the owners every year that are hiring coaches decide ahead of time, I'm not hiring somebody on defense,
Yep.
right? Like, so I think there's a lot of things that go into all of these.
Two things. When Matt Rule got fired and he took the Nebraska job, I had people in my mention saying, "Why would Matt Rule do anything other than move to the Bahamas and just hang out?" And I said, "Because if he plays his cards right, he will get another $40 million. You're getting fired from Nebraska. It's possible to live two dreams at once and get
Right.
$80 million for not coaching football. Or best case scenario is you save Nebraska. The thing with the Carolina job that we haven't even brought up is that they have something to work with the quarterback, and Bryce Young has played so poorly that any
Mhm.
improvement can be seen as quarterback whisperer guru type stuff. And like what we saw with Goff with McVay a couple of years
Goff,
ago.
yep.
Like I think the bar is so low that just making him look competent, which he will once the offensive line is cleaned up, I think is going to be a huge step forward. All right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'd agree. I think like that was exactly what I was gonna bring up was the Goff thing. It's like the attractiveness in the job, like, really does depend on what you think of Bryce Young,
Right.
right? Like, because he's really I mean, maybe Ike Kwanu, but, like, how many guys there are building blocks? Like,
Right.
Brian Burns in a contract here, Derek Brown's gonna be going into one, and JC Horn's been hurt. Like, I don't know, like, I think, like, you have to look at this and say, it really the attractiveness of that job like rides on two things, like what you think of the idea of working with David Tepper, and then what you think of Bryce Young.
Yeah. Yeah. You can take this anywhere you want because you've profiled a bunch of teams in the last 2 weeks, whether that's the Packers, the Lions, whomever. The most intriguing team in the NFL to you is who?
Um, I'm interested to see what happens with the
Yeah.
Packers because I mean, against two pretty good teams, right? Now the Chargers record is what it is, but they beat the Chargers and they beat the Lions. I think we can agree the Lions are one of the best teams
Yep.
in the NFC. And I just one thing that's so interesting about the Packers is like, yes, there's like the formula that they've used at quarterback that they're rebooting now with Jordan Love. And there's evidence, if you go back and you look at Aaron Rodgers' first 24
Yeah.
starts, in Green Bay, they were 10-14, right? Like, and then it really took off in his second year as a starter, which was his fifth year as a pro. And we're still a year away from being there with Jordan Love. Jordan Love's like some of the stuff we saw against the Lions looks sustainable. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
looks like real quarterbacking. And I think the other thing that's interesting about them is they've got this group of skill position players that is like sort of like growing up with Jordan Love. Like that's not Randall Cobb and
Right.
Devontae Adams and Robert Tunyon. Like that's
Youngest
not like
offense in
Aaron Rodgers.
football by like 2 years.
Yeah, it's like it's Christian Watson, it's Romeo Dobbs, it's Jaden Reed, it's Luke Musgrave, it's Tucker Kraft. Like It's these guys that are growing up with him. Now, I think like a lot of it is going to ride on what happens with their offensive line and like guys like Rasheed Walker, who like is like losing David Bakhtiari was a massive, massive blow for them. But if they can keep growing on offense, like I think their defense as they get healthier, as they get Jair Alexander back and Darnell Savage back and all of those guys back, like their defense has a chance. There's like real horses on defense there. Like Rashawn Gary is one of the best defensive players in football. Kenny Clark's a pro. Devontae Campbell, when he comes back, is a good player. Preston Smith, like so. I think the Packers are that team where it's like if they can just get in, like they'll get in like at a point where they're ascending. So they're one that's like I don't think enough people are paying attention to that I think is really interesting right now. The one that I'm fascinated to see in the playoffs is Baltimore.
Yes.
I just think like new coordinators on both sides of the ball. John Harbaugh's rebooted that thing with Mike McDonald on offense and Mike McDonald on defense and Todd Monken on offense, and they look like fast and talented all over the place. And Lamar is playing really well, and so I'm really interested to see what this version of the Ravens looks like in the AFC playoffs. Are they the top contender right now to Kansas City? I mean, I think it's probably them in Jacksonville, right? Like, which we wouldn't have said before the year.
Can you explain this Denver thing to me? This is unbelievable. And I keep looking at it and I keep I obviously they give up 70 points. It was funny because somebody brought this up the other day. When we think about the entire journey of Denver differently if they'd given up 35 points to the Dolphins and lost by 20 points than if they gave up 70. Like was the 70 and that singular breakdown just so significant that we just wrote off the entire franchise this year? I think there is part of that because teams just don't give up 70.
Yeah.
But the improvement they've had on defense, the improvement Russell Wilson's had every single week. I don't want to overstate this, but them being 6-5 from where they were at the beginning of the season, and maybe we shouldn't have so quickly dismissed one of the best quarterbacks coaches in the history of football in Sean Payton. But like this is bordering on a football miracle, Albert.
I would say, I had a great conversation with Justin Simmons about this. Yeah. And like Justin, so obviously he's, sort of the veteran leader of that defense now.
Seen a lot of bad football.
Like with guys like Von Miller and Bradley Chubb gone. And like, so it was really, I asked him about VJ, and he had the background of having played for VJ when he was the head coach, a few years ago. And, I asked him about like what kind of kept them locked in after that, because that's the sort of debacle where you can lose a team if you're a coach, right? And there were a lot of people calling for Vance Joseph's head. And he said, like, I had a belief in him because I played for him before. And he's like, and I think the rest of the guys got a belief in him because he told them the truth. And a couple days after they lost that game in Miami, they watched a bunch of clips of all of their bad plays from the Miami game, right? Like all the bad stuff. And then he showed a bunch of clips of the good stuff. And he kind of showed them like, and I know it sounds like a hokey football thing, but his whole thing was like, who do we want to be? And if you look at it, this is an amazing thing. I looked this up and I was blown away by it. Nobody was really talking about it a few weeks ago, but there was like a 5 or 6 week stretch where they were improving in yards allowed and points allowed every week, like week over week, every week they got better. And, I think Sean Payton deserves a lot more credit than we're giving him for this because, at a time when no one would have thought like their formula would be run game and defense, and shortening the game and playing. When they hired Sean Payton, nobody would have thought that. When Miami scored 70 points on them, nobody would have thought that. But I think Sean was patient with Vance Joseph. He was patient with the roster. He was patient with the formula. And, it's sort of reflective of the kind of training camp they had where it was a really tough training camp. Like I know when I talked to Sean about it, he compared it to like the first training camp the Saints had in Mississippi. And you can't do training camp that way, right? Like the way you did in 2006.
He does his Parcells impression about training camp. There's no light in the tunnel. Don't even look. Don't even look for the light in the tunnel. He does a very good Parcells.
It's all this stuff though. Like, and it's like, I think when you have experience on your coaching staff, like we all look for like the next great thing, the next young guy, right? And I do think like one of the things that that staff had was there was a lot of experience in that staff. Like Joe Lombardi's coached for, and we can say what we want about him as a coordinator, but he's coached for Sean Payton forever. Vance Joseph has been in leadership roles in the league for a bunch of different teams, and so I think like having the experience of having gone through it and having the faith that it was eventually going to work, even after that Miami game, I think they deserve credit for it. And I think Sean Payton deserves credit too, in that like this is so different than his formula in New Orleans,
Hmm.
right? It's so different than the way that they won in New Orleans. And I think that's a real credit to Sean for like looking at Russell Wilson and not thinking this can't work.
Yeah.
Like this guy's broken. It's like, no, like let's get him involved in the run game. Let's limit what he does a little bit. Let's get him making scramble plays again. And let's see what we have. And I think right now Sean Payton's getting the most out of his roster because they had a plan. They understood what they had on the roster and they stuck with the plan even when things looked really, really horrible in September.
All right, so you had a column about Kyler the other day, and I think that's another situation that is playing out completely differently than we thought. Because there are reports now
Yep.
that he loves the new regime. Everybody's getting along. He's obviously playing well. That team is playing well, better than we thought. They're not going to get a top two pick, top three pick, and they might end up getting a good enough pick to get a great skill guy, a great offensive side of the ball guy, and then all of a sudden they're in prime position, right?
Well,
Uh,
unless Marvin Harrison goes back to school.
Unless Mar is that are there are the collectives working on that? No, and
Yeah.
so that I loved when he said he was undecided after the game. I loved that. Yeah, just
Uh,
just got to go through the process. Maybe he can check with scouts to see if he would be a day one pick.
yeah, I don't know if he's got his paperwork
Yeah,
back from the board
yeah,
there.
exactly, exactly. Maybe get a Senior Bowl invite, one of those All Star games. But it kind of speaks to something that. So I thought there was going to be a lot more quarterback movement this winter, and the reason I thought that, or this spring, the reason I thought that was I thought Kyler would get replaced by Drake May or Caleb Williams. Not going to happen. I thought there'd be a healthy Kirk Cousins who would at least start a bidding war, whether or not to go back to Minnesota or go somewhere else. He would have a massive market because, as you know, coaches love Kirk Cousins. Like coaches, there's so
Yeah.
many coaches in the Shanahan tree who are like, God, we should have a player like that. Like who can just make the throws,
Yeah.
fire in those blind throws. They love that stuff. Is there a quarterback movement story you're watching right now that maybe has
Sure.
emerged over the past couple of weeks or months?
I would say, well, so the one thing that's so interesting about just on Kyler, um, like I think what's fascinating about Kyler's situation, he until this year basically played in the same offense. He's played in the same offense since high
Yeah,
school. You know what I mean? Like so, like going from Allen High School in Dallas to Texas A&M under Kevin Sumlin um, to obviously Oklahoma with Lincoln Riley, and then Arizona with Cliff Kingsbury. It was always like this air raid offense, and this is the first time he's had to like really change. And like again, like I've talked to their coaches who've said he really dove into it. Like he really was excited about learning something new. And what's fascinating about his situation to me is he's got a chance to play them out of one of the top two
yep,
picks, right? Like, and then you sort of look at the context of his contract and trying to get out of his contract a little bit differently. I wouldn't rule out that they wind up offloading him, but I would say like he's got a chance to really materially affect that. I I think what's going to be really interesting, Kevin, is the fate of the 2021 draft class
mm,
and what happens to all of those guys, except for obviously taking Trevor Lawrence out of it. He probably becomes much, much wealthier this offseason, right? But the other guys who were taken in the first round, what becomes of those four guys, right? And so you'd assume Trey Lance would maybe get another, developmental year in Dallas behind Dak, right? Like, so like that's probably the way that one plays out. What happens to Zach Wilson? What happens to Mac Jones? What happens to Justin Fields? Like I think all of those situations are interesting because there's something there. And then, you sort of look at Baker Mayfield, and like he's played pretty well for Tampa, like, and he's been a bunch of different places. And so I just think that there's all of these like highly drafted quarterbacks that kind of got thrown out the door. And in part because their teams took like the opposite approach of
right,
what we just talked about with the Packers with Jordan Love. And like, are any of those guys salvageable? Right? Like, is there one of those guys who we're going to be talking about in 3 or 4 years, like Geno Smith? Right? Like, where it's like that guy was just in a bad situation, and that guy's a competent starting quarterback in the NFL. Like, like to me, like what's so interesting about where we're going with so many of these guys is like, we've so many of these guys, so many of the quarterbacks have been through so many different coaches, and it's coordinator changes, it's head coach changes, it's general manager changes. Like these guys get 4 years in and they played for three different guys. And, you know, I just think there's like a nature versus nurture thing there where
100%.
is there something with one of these guys that can be mined? Is there something with one of these guys where you could bring him in and give him a 2-year deal, and maybe on the back end of that 2-year deal, you really have something? Like, I think that there's, because we're going to be talking about like, and forget about Drake May and Caleb Williams.
Sure.
We're going to be talking about JJ McCarthy and
Yep.
Quinn Ewers and Michael Penix and Bo Nix and Jaden Daniels is going to be super interesting, right? And we're going to be talking about all these guys like, oh yeah, they're definitely going to make it as starters, and the numbers tell us they won't.
Right.
And so I think there's like a real nature versus nurture thing that we may be able to see play out with the 21 quarterbacks based on what happens with them.
If you had, just reading the tea leaves and the situation, if I was going to take a flyer on any of those 2021 guys, it would be Justin Fields.
Yeah.
Just because he has one elite skill that we know you can build around, and then he can throw the ball. And it's so funny because you talked about this, but like I remember being on Titus's pod a couple months ago, and he was like, Ohio State fans are like, wait, he runs and doesn't throw? Like, what the hell? Like, what's going on here? So, like, we
Yeah.
know there's a floor there, and I'd like to see him not in the Chicago Bears ecosystem.
Yeah, and what Ryan Day would tell everybody who would, I think you could even see it the other night, right? Like there was a throw he made to Cole Kmet over the middle where, I mean, it was a casino blitz, right? Like, and everyone's coming, and Justin takes like 2 steps back and just he knows where his receiver is, and he pops it over the line to Cole Kmet, and he looked cool, calm, and collected in that moment. And I think like even if even a couple months ago, like he's ducking and covering and like he's eating that ball. And what Ryan Day would tell everybody who would listen is he just needs to play.
Yeah.
And because of the coaching changes, because of the injuries, a lot of that's been sabotaged. But he needs what like it's really hard for a team to give him, which is just playing time
Yeah.
and just let him ride it out. I mean, we're seeing that with Jordan Love now, right? Matt LaFleur has never wavered, right? It's they're sticking with Jordan Love. And he knows like Jordan just needs to accumulate things he's seen. Like he just needs to accumulate a library in his head of, okay, I've seen this. Now I'm going to do this. I have an answer for this because I saw this a couple weeks ago. And I think that was like what Ryan Day always said about Justin. It's what he told all the teams about Justin was he just needs to play. He just needs to play. He needs to learn a system. He needs to play. You need to give him time because he can get there. Because he's a good enough kid. He's tough. He's a hard worker. He'll do all of that. And so that's the problem Justin's going to have.
Yeah.
Is like is somebody willing to give him that
Right.
time? And I don't know. I don't know if you're not investing a first round pick in the guy, if you are willing to give a guy the time that Justin might need to get there. Because I do think if you gave him time, like if the Bears stick with him through the end of the year and then those guys survive and they're with him again next year, like I think you could have something.
Tickets to the game, merch, meals at iconic restaurants, stays at Caesar's Palace. All this can be yours when you bet with Caesar Sportsbook. Win or lose, every bet earns reward credits, which you can redeem across the empire. Now, if you haven't started yet, use the code OMAHAFULL and then place your first bet up to $1,250. If you win, great, you keep those winnings. But if you lose, you get your stake back as a bonus bet.
All right, we'll get you out of here on this coaching carousel. You mentioned Bill Belichick having a guaranteed job in 2024. Is there in your mind a natural fit? Because I go back to, okay, the Chargers would fit, but the Spanos family want to give that kind of money to a guy who's going to command it. Would David Tepper want to turn over his franchise to a guy like Bill Belichick? I don't know. That might solve a couple of his problems. Is there a natural fit if the what seems inevitable conclusion in New England happens?
I mean, I thought the most natural fit, like, and you're going to laugh at this, was Dallas. But like, I think we can stop talking about Dallas now because Mike McCarthy's done a really good job this year and deserves credit. And they're going to be in the playoffs, and that job's not going to be open. I don't think right now. So I would say, Washington to me is interesting because they have some defensive pieces, and like there's obviously a geographic thing, which he's from, he's effectively from
Yep.
Annapolis, grew up 45 minutes away from there. It's a historic franchise. I also think for guys like Tepper and Harris, getting Bill Belichick's a credibility play
Yes.
for them, right? Like where,
And
like
it
if
gives
you
you a
look at
buffer. It gives you a buffer. And you say, well, I hired Bill Belichick and he told me to do this. So
right,
you look like a better owner.
right, and it's like it's sort of like when Shad Khan had
Yeah.
messed it up 15 times and then hires Tom Coughlin,
Yeah.
right? Like it's like when Steve Ross comes in the league and he's got Bill Parcells
Parcells,
there,
yeah.
right? Like and those guys were in executive roles, but the reason you
What
hire
about when
someone
Jimmy
like
Haslam hired Mike Holmgren for some reason?
no, that wasn't Haslam though. I don't think that was.
Oh,
that
Randy
was
Lerner.
actually
That was Randy
that was
Lerner.
Randy
Oh my
Lerner. That
God.
was actually Randy
That was a
Lerner's. I
horrible
believe.
idea, but I get it.
That was Randy
Oh my
Lerner's last
God.
stand.
Yeah.
His last stand, right?
Great. Good job, Randy.
But I do think like that. I think that like I think that whole thing like it's a credibility play.
Yeah.
And I think if you're going to hire him, you have to have a team that's ready to win now. The Panthers just like it seems like they had that last year. Like if you take last year's roster, it's still a DJ Moore and Christian McCaffrey and Brian Burns with some contract left and Derek Brown and a healthier JC Horn. Like you look at like the Panthers a year ago and you would have said yes. Now, I don't know, man. Like they look like they might be a couple off seasons away, And so the Commanders are the team where it's like I look at their roster and it's like it's not horrible, I mean, now they got rid of the ends and you're gonna have to replace them, but Daron Payne, Jonathan Allen, if you think Emmanuel Forbes can play, maybe you got something there. The offensive line needs work, but at the skill positions, you have Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. Sam Howell at least can be a good stopgap, and you're going to have cap space.
Yeah.
So, and a high pick, so I think Washington's the one that still makes the most sense. Now the Chargers make a ton of sense. Would Bill move across the country? Would the Spanoses pay him?
Right.
Those are the two questions, The Chargers make a sense for a million different reasons. And if they're looking to if they're again, like looking for relevance, I guess would be the right word in Los Angeles in a market where it's really tough to get relevance. Is this like the Lakers hiring Phil Jackson?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, that to me would make some sense. I don't know if Bill would want to go across the country, but the idea of it's fascinating and really, really fun. Like, the idea that you could have Bill Belichick and Justin Herbert and all those guys on defense could get really interesting fast.
Albert Breer, thank you so much. Enjoy your frozen mounds of dirt, buddy.
All right. Thanks, Kevin.
Appreciate you.